Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Kahani Suno, the podcast where we bring you stories that will make you think, feel, and maybe lose a little sleep tonight. I am your host, Kabir. Before we dive in, I want to say thank you to all of you who've been writing in with your suggestions and feedback. It means the world to us that you're connecting with these stories. Today's story is a psychological thriller that asks a simple but terrifying question. What would you do if you woke up one day and everyone you knew had disappeared? What if you were the last person on earth? Or worse, what if you only thought you were? This is a story about isolation, about fragile nature of reality, and about how our mind can play tricks on us in ways we never imagined. It's called The 2 Minutes. And I have to warn you, this one has a twist ending that's going to stay with you long after the episode's end. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let me take you on a journey into one man's nightmare. Here we go. He woke up slowly, fighting against the heaviness that seemed to pull him back down into the depths of sleep. It was as if he had slept a very long time. The sensation was strange, disorienting. When he finally managed to pry his eyes open and focus on the bedside clock, it was just 8:30 in the morning. He blinked, trying to make sense out of it. Just 8:30? It felt like he'd been asleep for a very long time. He reached across the bed for Sophie, his hand searching for the familiar warmth of her body. But she had already gotten up. The sheets on her side were cool to the touch. Gary sat up slowly, running his fingers through his hair, trying to shake off his lingering grogginess that clung to him like a fog. He shuffled down the hallway to the kids' bedroom, expecting to hear the usual morning chaos, the sounds of cartoon playing too loud or the kids arguing over whose turn it was to use the bathroom. But when he pushed open the door, he found the room empty. The beds were made, toys neatly arranged on the shelves. It was unusually tidy. Maybe Sophie had taken them out for an early morning drive to the park or to grab breakfast. Maybe they had just left him sleep in. He deserved it, didn't he? He'd been working so hard lately. Gary had what most people call a blessed life, a terrific job as a senior consultant at one of the city's most prestigious firms, a great wife who somehow managed to keep their household running smoothly despite his long hours. 2 wonderful kids, Emma, who was 7 and loved to draw, and little Michael, just 5, who wanted to be an astronaut when he grew up. Sure, there was a war going on somewhere on the other side of the world. You couldn't escape it on the news. But it was still far, far away from this suburban paradise. Here in this quiet neighborhood with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns, it was all contentment. Happy families living happy lives, protected from the chaos of the outside world. He walked leisurely into the kitchen, his bare feet padding across the cool tile floor. The morning sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, casting a warm glow across the counter. He went through the familiar motions of making coffee, measuring out the grounds, pouring the water, listening to the comforting gurgle of the machine as it began to brew. When it was ready, he poured himself a cup and took a long sip. The taste was wonderful, rich and strong, exactly the way he liked it. He carried the mug into the living room and flicked on the television. He never missed the morning news roundup. It was part of his routine, as essential as brushing his teeth or putting on his tie. The news anchor's face filled the screen, her expression grave and serious. She was talking about the war again. Of course, she was. What else was there to talk about these days? More casualties, more debates about strategy, more political finger pointing. Gary found himself wondering, not for the first time, when it would ever stop. Would they ever have peace in their lifetimes? Would Emma and Michael grow up in a world where war wasn't the constant backdrop to their daily life? The thought was depressing and he pushed it away. He had to get ready for work. There was a big presentation this afternoon and he needed to review his notes one more time. Gary turned to the kitchen and fixed himself a quick breakfast. A whole wheat sandwich with turkey and cheese and tall glass of orange juice. As he sat standing at the counter, he realized something. He hadn't seen today's newspaper yet. Usually, Sophie brought it in from the driveway and he would wake up to find it waiting for him on the bedside table or at the breakfast table. It was one of those small gestures that he had come to expect, even take for granted. He walked to the front door and opened it, expecting to find the paper lying on the welcome mat. What he saw instead made him stop short. There was a pile of newspapers on the doorstep. Not just today's paper, but multiple papers, still wrapped in their plastic sleeves. He counted them quickly. 7, 8. More than a week's supply lying there, undisturbed, slowly yellowing in the morning sun. Panic flickered at the edges of his consciousness. What on earth was going on here? Had Sophie not been getting the paper all week? But that didn't make sense. She was meticulous about these things, and why would there be so many? Had the delivery person been doubling up? He left the papers where they were and rushed back inside to the telephone in the hallway. His hands were trembling slightly as he picked up the receiver. There was a normal dial tone, nothing out of the ordinary. The familiar hum was almost reassuring. Gary frantically dialed Sophie's mobile number. Would picture the phone in his mind, the pink case with the little charm she had bought at the beach last summer. It would be ringing wherever she was, playing that cheerful ringtone she'd chosen. But there was no response. It rang and rang and rang, and then went to the voicemail. He heard her voice, bright and friendly. "Hi, you've reached Sophie. I can't take your call right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." He didn't leave a message. Instead, he hung up and stood there for a moment, his heart beginning to beat faster. Maybe she'd left her phone at home. Maybe it was charging in the bedroom. But even as he thought this, he knew it wasn't true. Sophie never went anywhere without her phone, especially not with the kids. He walked to the front door again and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, with just a hint of warmth that would come later in the day. He looked up and down the street. Everything appeared absolutely ordinary. The sun was up, bright and cheerful in a cloudless blue sky. The lawns were mowed, the hedges neatly trimmed. The road had been swept clean, not a leaf or piece of litter in sight. The Henderson's American flag hung limply from its pole. The Rodriguez family's minivan sat in their driveway, exactly where it always was. But not a soul could be seen. Gary stood there on his front porch, looking up and down the street, waiting for something, anything to move. But nothing did. Not a person walking their dog, not a jogger making their morning rounds, not a car driving past, not even a bird flitting from tree to tree or squirrel scampering across the lawns. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. It was unnatural. Something was really strange. He walked across his front lawn, the grass still damp with morning dew, and leaned over the white picket fence that separated their yard from the Hardy's property. Bill, he called out, his voice sound oddly loud in the stillness. Bill Hardy was a retired dentist in his late 60s, a friendly man with a deep love for gardening. He was usually out tending to his roses at this time of the day, pruning and watering, talking to his plants as if they were old friends. Gary had often joked with him about it. "Do they talk back?" he'd ask, and Bill would laugh and say, "Not yet, but I'm working on it." But this morning there was no sign of Bill anywhere. His garden tools were lined up neatly against the side of the house. His roses were in full bloom, vibrant reds, yellows, and pinks, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. Gary hopped over the fence, something he'd never done before, but these were unusual circumstances, and walked up to the Hardys' front door. He rang the doorbell and waited, listening to the chimes echo through the house. No answer. He rang again, holding the button down longer this time. Still nothing. He tried the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily in his hand, and the door swung open. "Bill?" he called out as he stepped inside. "Bill, are you home? It's Gary from next door." The house was immaculate. The Hardys had always kept a clean home, but this was something else. Everything was in its place. Magazines aligned perfectly on the coffee table, cushioned, fluffed, and arranged just so not a speck of dust anywhere. It looked like a model house staged for prospective buyers, but it felt empty, lifeless. Gary walked through the living room into the kitchen, calling out Bill's name again and again. He checked the den, the bathroom, even climbed the stairs to peer into the bedrooms, but there was no one. The house was completely deserted. It was as if Bill and his wife Martha had simply vanished into thin air, leaving everything exactly as it was. A chill ran down Gary's spine. He hurried back outside, suddenly feeling like an intruder, like he was trespassing in a place he didn't belong. He walked quickly down the street to the next block, where there was a small neighborhood park, just a few benches, some swings and slides, and some grassy area where kids played soccer. Sophie usually took Emma and Michael there on sunny mornings like this. They loved the swings. Emma could pump her legs and swing so high that Sophie would joke she'd fly right over the top bar. But the park was absolutely deserted. The swings hung motionless, their chains still. The slide gleamed in the sunlight, unused. The grass was empty. So was the street, and the next street, and the one after that. Panicking now, Gary ran back to his house. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. He must be dreaming. That was it. This was all just some bizarre nightmare, and any moment now he would wake up in his bed with Sophie beside him and the kids arguing in the next room. Or maybe he was dead. Maybe he died in his sleep, and this was some kind of purgatory, some kind of punishment. He slowly pulled himself together, forcing himself to breathe deeply, to think rationally. He must not allow panic to overpower him. There had to be an explanation. There always was. Just then he heard it, The faint ring of the living room phone. The sound was so normal, so ordinary, that it almost made him laugh with relief. Of course, someone was calling. Sophie was calling to tell him where she'd gone. He rushed back inside and grabbed the receiver. Hello? Hello? Sophie? Hello? And it took all his willpower to stop himself from screaming into the phone. There was no answering voice on the other end. He could hear breathing. He was sure of it, but no one spoke. And then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, he heard the decisive click of the phone being put down. Gary stared at the receiver in his hand, his knuckles white from gripping it so hard. He took a deep breath and checked the caller ID. The display showed a number he recognized immediately. It was his cousin David, calling from Boston on the East Coast. David, who worked in finance and always called at the most random times to chat about the stock market or the Red Sox. Gary quickly dialed the number back. The phone began to ring and ring and ring. He counted 10 rings, 15, 20. No one picked up. Now, no answering machine, just endless ringing. The terrifying thought flashed through his mind, unwanted and undeniable. Was he the only one alive on the whole face of the earth? Gary could feel the bile rising in his throat. Fear was overwhelming him, threatening him to drown him. His hand shook as he set the phone back in its cradle. No, he told himself firmly. He was just being stupid. There was a rational explanation for all of this. There was some kind of emergency evacuation that he had slept through. Maybe there had been a gas leak or a chemical spill, and everyone had been evacuated while he slept. Sophie would have tried to wake him, of course, but maybe she couldn't. Maybe the authorities had forced everyone to leave immediately. Yes, that made sense. That had to be it. Sophie would call him any moment now, her voice apologetic and worried, telling him she tried to wake him but couldn't, telling him where to meet them. She'd probably forgotten her cell phone in the rush to leave. She had always been a bit absent-minded about things like that. Once she'd driven all the way to her sister's house 2 hours away before realizing she'd left her purse on the kitchen counter. Gary checked his watch. It was already 9:45. If he was going to figure this out, he couldn't just stand here in the house. He needed to go to work. Someone there would know what was happening. His boss or his assistant or someone. Yes, he would go to work. The car started smoothly enough. When he turned the key in the ignition, the engine purred to life. The radio came on, playing some pop song he didn't recognize. It no longer surprised him that everything seemed to be working normally. The electricity was on, the phone had a dial tone, the TV was broadcasting, the water ran when he had washed his hands. Everything was functioning perfectly. The only problem was that every living thing, every person, every animal, every bird had disappeared from view. Gary backed out of his driveway and began the familiar route to his office downtown. The roads were completely deserted. Not a single car could be seen in any direction. He drove down Main Street, which was usually clogged with morning traffic. Commuters rushing to work, parents dropping kids off at school, delivery trucks making their rounds. But today, it was empty, abandoned. And yet, Strangely, all the shops were open. As he drove slowly past them, he could see the lights were on inside. The open signs were displayed in the windows. Everything looked ready for business. He pulled over in front of Morrison's hardware store, a place he'd been coming for years. He got out of the car and approached the door, which stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The familiar smell of the place hit him: sawdust and paint and metal. Everything was in its place, tools hung on their pegboard displays. Paint cans were stacked neatly on shelves. A cash register sat on the counter, its drawer closed. But there were no customers browsing the aisles. And more disturbing, there was no sign of old Morrison, who had owned and run the store for 40 years and who was always here during business hours. "Hello," Gary called out. "Is anyone here? Mr. Morrison?" His voice echoed through the empty store. No response. Gary could no longer contain his terror. It was rising up inside him like a wave, threatening to crash over him and pull him under. Where was everyone? Where had they all gone? More through force of habit than any real hope of finding answers, he drove on to his workplace, a sleek glass and steel office building in the heart of downtown. He was no longer surprised to see that there was not a single car in the parking lot as he pulled into his usual spot near the entrance. The lot that was usually completed full by 8 o'clock in the morning was now a vast expanse of empty asphalt. He got out of his car and stood there for a moment, looking up at the building. The lights were on inside. He could see them through the windows, floor after floor glowing with fluorescent brightness. The revolving door at the entrance was slowly turning, powered by its motor, waiting for people who would never come. Gary jogged up the flight of stairs. He never took the elevator for just 3 floors and pushed open the door to his office suite. Usually, this place was a beehive of activity at this time of morning. Phones ringing, people chatting by the coffee machine, the clatter of keyboards, the hum of printers. His assistant Jennifer would be at her desk, greeting him with her usual cheerful "Good morning, Gary." His colleagues would be in the conference room arguing about the best approach to some account or the other. But today, the office felt like a crypt, silent, still, dead. There was no one, absolutely no one. Desks sat abandoned, coffee mugs still half full beside computer monitors that glowed with screensavers. Someone had left their jacket draped over the back of a chair. A bag of chips sat open on a desk, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and would be right back. The thought crept unbidden into Gary's mind. He must surely be the only person left alive in this town, maybe in this state, maybe in the entire country, maybe in the whole world. He was nearly senseless with horror and fear. His legs felt weak and he had to grab onto the edge of the desk to steady himself. His breathing was coming in short, sharp gasps. But then a spark of determination flared inside him. No, he must not give in to despair. There had to be someone he could reach, someone who could explain what was happening. He went to the desk and pulled out his phone. He started calling everyone he knew, Sophie again and again. Though he knew she wouldn't answer, his parents in His best friend Tom, who lived just across town, the police department, the fire department, the hospital, the mayor's office. There was an identical response to every single call. The phone would ring and ring and ring, endlessly, pointlessly. No one ever picked up. No answering machines, no voicemails, just ringing. He even tried calling international numbers, his college roommates who'd moved to London, a former colleague who'd relocated to Tokyo. Same thing. Ring, ring, ring. No, Gary told himself firmly, setting down the phone. He must not lose hope. There was still one possibility, one slim thread of hope to cling to. David. His cousin David in Boston had called him in the morning. Gary hadn't been able to speak to him, true, but the fact that the call had come through meant something, didn't it? It meant that life still existed somewhere. Maybe whatever had happened there, whatever inexplicable event had caused everyone in this town to disappear, was localized. Maybe it was just this area. Maybe if he drove east, drove to Boston, he would find David safe and sound, and David would help him figure out what to do, how to find Sophie and the kids. Yes, that was what he would do. He would drive to Boston. It was about 15-hour drive, maybe longer if he kept to the speed limit. Though who was there to enforce speed limits now? Who could make it there by midnight or early tomorrow morning at the latest? Gary grabbed his briefcase, a ridiculous gesture, really, but it made him feel more grounded, more normal, and he headed back to his car. He checked his wallet. He had about $60 in cash and several credit cards. Though he had no idea if credit cards would work if there was no one to process the transaction. The fuel gauge read nearly empty. Of course it did. He'd been meaning to fill up for days but kept putting it off. Gary drove to the nearest gas station, pulling up to the pumps. The station was deserted like everything else, but the pumps were on. The digital displays glowed, ready to dispense fuel. He got out of the car and reached for the pump. As he did, his finger caught in the car door as it swung shut. He had misjudged the distance, and the door had more momentum than he'd thought. Gary swore loudly, the curse word echoing across the empty gas station. The pain was immediate and intense, racing through his body like wildfire. It was the worst pain he had ever experienced. It felt like his entire hand was on fire. Every nerve ending was screaming in agony. He stared down at his hand, expecting to see blood, broken bones, mangled flesh, but there was just a tiny bruise on his ring finger, a small purple mark, barely noticeable. That was all. How could such a minor injury could cause such overwhelming pain? It didn't make sense, but then again, nothing made sense anymore. Not the empty streets, not the abandoned homes, not the ringing phones that no one answered. What was one more inexplicable thing added to this pile? Gary filled his tank using his credit card. The machine accepted it without question, just as it had 1,000 times before. He got back in the car and pulled out onto the highway, heading east. He had been driving now for over 2 days, stopping only when absolutely necessary for gas, to use a restroom at an abandoned rest stop, to grab food from a deserted convenience store. He hadn't slept. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, even for a moment, he saw Sophie's face, Emma's smile, Michael's bright eyes. He heard his voices calling to him. He had to keep moving. He had to find them. Exhaustion was taking its toll on him. His eyes felt like they were filled with sand. His vision blurred at the edges. He could barely make out the road ahead. The white lines marking the lanes seemed to shimmer and dance, and he had to blink hard to keep them in focus. But he kept driving. Hope pushed him forward, drove him on. Boston was close now, just another hour, maybe two. He could make it. He would make it. He didn't see the curve coming, or maybe he saw it, but his exhausted brain couldn't process the information quickly enough to react. Or maybe he fell asleep for just a second, just one crucial second. Crash. The sound was tremendous. Metal crumpling, glass shattering, the screech of tires on asphalt. The airbag deployed, slamming into his chest and face with brutal force, shocking him awake. For a moment, he didn't know where he was or what had happened. His ears were ringing. His vision was filled with white fabric. Then the airbag deflated and he could see. He looked down at himself. There was blood everywhere. It soaked his shirt, ran down his arms, dripped onto the deployed airbag. So much blood. How could one person have so much blood? Gary tried to open the door, but it was jammed. He threw his shoulder against it once, twice. On the third try, it gave way with a groan of twisted metal. He staggered out of the car. It was a complete wreck, wrapped around a concrete barrier on the side of the highway. The front end was crushed beyond recognition. Steam hissed from the radiator. One wheel was still spinning slowly. It wouldn't be going anywhere soon. Wouldn't be going anywhere ever again, really. Gary stood there, swaying slightly, and started walking toward the nearest exit ramp. You could see a sign indicating that there was a town just a mile ahead. Maybe there would be people there. Maybe Boston had been the wrong destination all along. Maybe he just needed to keep searching. And then, as he walked, something occurred to him, something strange. He had absolutely no pain. He was covered in blood, had just been in a catastrophic car crash, and yet he felt nothing. No pain in his chest from the airbag impact, no cuts stinging, no broken bones aching, nothing. He was too tired now to even be shocked by the revelation, too exhausted to question it. He just plodded on, one foot in front of the other, heading toward the town whose name he couldn't remember, didn't care about. It was then that he saw them. Finally, blessedly, he saw them. A group of teenagers, maybe 5 or 6 of them, hanging out near a drugstore at the edge of town. They were laughing, talking, gesturing animatedly. Real people, living people. Wild with happiness, with relief so intense, it made him want to cry. Gary ran toward them. "Hey," he shouted. "Hey, over here, please. I need help." But as he drew nearer to them, something strange happened. They began to seem vague, insubstantial. Their forms became less solid, more translucent, like images projected on smoke. Gary reached out to grab the arm of the nearest teenager, a boy with shaggy brown hair and a skateboard. His hand passed right through him. Gary stumbled and nearly fell. He turned around, his heart pounding. The teenagers were still there, still talking and laughing, but they hadn't noticed him. They gave no indication that they'd seen him running toward them, heard him shouting. It was as if he had become invisible to them, or as if they were ghosts, or as if he was. Gary looked around wildly. He could make out other vague shapes now, other translucent figures, people walking on the sidewalks, indistinct and hazy, a child skipping rope on the other side of the street, her form barely visible, a woman pushing a stroller, fading in and out like a bad television signal. They were all faint, as if he was looking at them through a fine mist or through water or through the veil that separated one world from another. Gary kept walking. What else could he do? He walked down the main street of his nameless town, past shops and houses, past the ghostly forms of people who couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, didn't know he existed. And then gradually things began to change. The figures around them started to look more solid, more real. The mist seemed to be clearing. He could make out faces now, expressions, details. A man in a business suit talking on his phone, a woman walking a golden retriever, a postal worker delivering mail. Somebody turned around and saw him, really looked at him, really saw him. It was a man in his 40s, wearing jeans and flannel shirt. He had kind eyes and a concerned expression. He started running toward Gary, his face full of alarm and worry. "Are you okay?" Gary could hear him saying, his voice clear and strong and wonderful, beautifully real. "Sir, are you okay? You are covered in blood. We need to get you to the hospital. Can you hear me?" Gary opened his mouth to respond, to say yes, to say thank God, to say please help me find my family, but no words came out. The world was starting to spin around him, faster and faster. The man's face swam in and out of focus. The sky tilted sideways, and then Gary blacked out, falling forward into darkness. Gary was dead. Sophie let out a sob, the sound raw and broken in the quiet hospital room. She'd been holding him in her arms for over an hour now, or maybe it was longer. Time had lost all meaning. The nurses had tried to make her let go, tried to gently pull her away, but she had refused. She needed these last few moments with him. After everything they'd been through, after 2 long, agonizing years, she deserved that much. For most of that hour, Gary had been still and peaceful, his breathing shallow but steady, his eyes closed. But then, in the last 2 minutes, something had changed. His eyes had flown open, wide and wild and terrified. He had stared at her, or through her, really, because there was no recognition in his gaze. It was as if he could no longer see her, as if she had become invisible to him. He began to mutter something. Sophie leaned in close, trying to understand. "Bill Hardy," he was saying. "Bill. Where is Bill? Bill Hardy. Their neighbor." Why was he asking for their neighbor? Then Gary had started shouting, "Hello, hello, can anyone hear me?" His voice was panicked, desperate. "Hello." Sophie had tried to talk to him, to soothe him. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking his hair. "I'm here. You're not alone. I am here." But his eyes looked right through her, seeing something or someone else entirely. He was living in the same other reality, some place she couldn't follow. And then, suddenly, he had screamed, a scream of pure agony that made the nurse come running. made Sophie's blood run cold. His face contorted in pain, and he seemed to be looking at his hand, at his ring finger specifically, though there was nothing there, nothing wrong with it at all. Sophie watched helpless as a range of expressions flitted across her husband's beloved face: terror, raw and absolute, pain, deep and searing, and then finally something else, something that looked almost like relief, like peace, like someone who had been lost for a very long time and had finally found his way home. Gary slumped in her arms. Sophie tried to revive him, pressing her hands against his chest, calling his name over and over, but his heart had stopped beating. The monitors beside his bed let out a long, sustained tone. The nurses pushed past her, trying to help, but she already knew. She could feel it. Her beloved husband was no more. Grief gripped Sophie's heart, squeezing it so tight she could barely breathe. But alongside that grief, there was something else. Something that made her feel guilty even as she acknowledged its presence. Relief. Relief that Gary was finally out of his misery. Relief that he was free. 2 years ago, Gary had suffered a massive stroke. It had happened on a Tuesday morning, just like any other morning. He'd been getting ready for work and had just finished his coffee, and he'd collapsed in the kitchen. By the time ambulance arrived, by the time they got him to the hospital, it was too late. The damage was done. The stroke had left him completely paralyzed. Locked in, the doctors called it. His mind was still there, still functioning, still aware, but he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except lie there, trapped inside his own body, watching the world go on without him. For 2 years, Sophie had cared for him. She'd learned to read the tiny movements of his eyes, the only part of him that still worked. One blink of yes, two for no. It was their only means of communication, their only connection. And in the silence of that hospital room, as the nurses made their phone calls and filled out the paperwork, Sophie said a prayer of thanks that Gary's long nightmare was over, and a prayer that wherever he was now, he found the peace that had eluded him for so long. And that's where our story ends. When I first wrote this story, I had to sit with it for a while. It's one of those tales that makes you question everything you think you know about reality. Gary wasn't the last man on earth. He wasn't experiencing some apocalyptic event. He was trapped, locked inside his own paralyzed body after a stroke, living with what felt like days and weeks in just the final 2 minutes of his life. Before we wrap up, I want to remind you that if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you're listening. Until then, this is Kabir from Kahani Suno, reminding you to listen carefully, think deeply, and never take the people you love for granted. Sweet dreams, everyone, and thank you for listening.